you don't mind, filming myself, putting this on YouTube, so
no problem.
Right. I'm a bit of an exhibition myself.
I feel like it's all
right. Thank you.
Continue with Mr. José Rivera on federal government behavior, especially the Katrina Fiasco, theoretical implications and contribution to the concept of welfare state replenishment.
All right. Well, I'd like to thank Dr. Reed for the introduction, and I also like to thank the audience for attending the panel today. All right? Can you hear me well? All right. My experience with natural disasters is somewhat limited. I am, however, observant enough to know that these have the potential, living in a tropical island, to turn into social catastrophes. The displacement, the loss of life, the damage to property and infrastructure are second to none and become headlines for the media, who dedicate substantial amounts of time to disaster coverage. Nevertheless, apart from these important considerations, my concern in this paper deals with the post-Katrina events, particularly our federal government's response to in the immediate aftermath, its portrayed indifference to human distress, and whether these actions are significant enough to elaborate abstractions towards a theory of the absent state. My work dwells on the historical theoretical, and I would appreciate any feedback. In case of the theoretical abstractions, where does this come from anyway? The concept, I'm working with a concept called the concept of the absent state, and this is a contribution that I'm trying to make towards the further development of a theory of the state. I'm not really sure whether there is the theory of the state, or I think there are multiple theories of the state, which includes not only parameters of state actions, but also define the state in the sense of what it does not do. For example, Christopher Pearson, which is a theorist of the state, gives us a window into the form. I quote, "We might find it difficult to give a precise definition of the state, but we think we recognize it when it flags us down the motorway, sends us a final tax demand, or, of course, arranges for an old age pension to be paid at the nearest post office. From the mandatory certification of our birth to the compulsory registration of our death, we tend to feel that the state is nearly always with us. In that sense, just as it is hard to point for its actions at what the state is, if the state is absent, particularly in an exceptional event such as Katrina, it is not noticeable even more so. We felt the state, and when I mean the state, I mean the federal government. We felt the state present in the recent economic stimulus package, which provided relief for some families and a much-needed financial injection into the U.S. economy. In the same manner, when the U.S. government failed to regulate the subprime loan market, millions of owners stood on the brink of losing what for many Americans is the pinnacle of individual liberty, which is home ownership. There was also claim for the state to intervene when a lot of individuals felt the student loan debt, which was due a consequence of the lack of regulation, was spiraling out of control. Whether understood or not by those elected to govern, the state is almost the sole entity that is able to come to its citizens' relief. I say almost because there are other entities, quasi-governmental, non-profit, religious, that can come to our aid if need be. But again, it is probably the state that can do it consistently and for a sustained period of time. Irrespectively of one's belief, whether it's small government or assess the measure of government in several aspects of our social and economic lives, when things go wrong, we'd rather have the state beside us or backing us up, even if we want it out of our homes. Can we imagine really a scenario where the state is not present? More to the point, as much as we love our individual liberties, Do we want to fend for ourselves in times of dire need, not relying on the solidarity of familiar and communal ties, or without the assistance of the state? I'd like, if I may, comment on the idea of welfare state retrenchment. According to Bruno Valier, he's a French theorist, I'd like to focus on the academic literature that went from dealing with notions of crisis, the focus, on the academic literature on welfare state retrenchment went from dealing with notions of crisis to assessing empirically changes in actual social policy. This is the avenue that I like to take. Retrenchment in this sense dealt with the reaction of Western welfare states and the regimes of social protection first to economic conditions in the 1970s, particularly the end of the 3 decades of consistent growth that stopped abruptly in 1973. Second, to renew ideological reaction from the right, from the political right, which in the case of the United States and the United Kingdom became a systematic effort of policy proposals destined to reduce, if not eliminate, social provisions rendered by the state. Retrenchment was not exclusive to countries where the political right dominated. France, for example, was forced to perform an about-turn in 1983 after 2 years of groundbreaking social policy that required a high degree of spending that eventually was impossible to sustain. There was François Mitterrand and a socialist government in place, a plural left government in place, between 1981 and 1986. The attack on the post-war welfare state was brutal and without quarter, at least in the discursive arena. There are 2 instances that are very illustrative, especially in the discursive manner. Margaret Thatcher was brilliant in that sense. In the midst of the minor strikes of 1983 and a self-doubting, second-guessing Conservative Party, Thatcher offered the Ladies Not Returning speech. I'm just going to read some excerpts. If our people feel that they are part of a great nation and they are prepared to wield the means to keep it great, a great nation we shall be and shall remain. So what can stop us from achieving this? What then stands in our way? The prospect of another winter of discontent? I suppose it might, referring to the minor strike, in 1983. To those waiting with bated breath for that favorite media catchphrase, the U-turn, I have only one thing to say. U-turn if you want to, the ladies not returning. I say that not only to you, but to our friends overseas, and also to those who are not our friends, meaning the unions. Perhaps the most deplorable of Thatcher's declarations was one made in 1987 during an interview where she argued that there is no such thing as society. She says, and I quote, "I think we have gone through a period when too many children and people have been given to understand I have problems. It is the government's job to cope with it. Or I have a problem, I will go and get a grant to cope with it. I am homeless, the government must house me. And so they are casting their problems on society. And who is society?" she asked. "There is no such thing. There are individual men and women, and there are families, and no government can do anything except through people, and people to look to themselves first." And you can see I have a problem with that. No such thing as society. I mean, this is very, I'm lost for words here. This is everything. As a social scientist, of course, there has to be a society. Otherwise, what am I studying social science for? Right? Though some of us may not agree with it, one can appreciate the impact of these discourses. They constitute a rallying cry for those on the political right who express a pathological disdain for the state. In the case of the United States, this derision was especially strong policy-wise, and the reason for taking measures to deregulate the economy, leaving the state, society, and individuals without the necessary tools to cope with exceptional events. During the Reagan years, the precedent was set in the tapping of Social Security funds. In the second half of the 1990s, a conservative Congress put up a Contract for America and the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families Act, and its emphasis on an individual's responsibility. All of it meant both to reduce an individual's dependence on the state and announce to him or her that from this point forward, you are on your own. Now, I'd like to elaborate briefly on the concept of the absent state. I believe the policy efforts of the Reagan administration, which lasted until 1988, the legislation produced by the 1994-2006 Congresses produced the policy outcomes and framework that severely limited state action to intervene proactively in the socio-economic, social-political, and social-psychological dynamics of the United States. The Clinton administration was the first to feel those constraints as having inherited a federal government redefined by conservative thought and policy, was further constricted by having to interact and negotiate with a Congress that was the antithesis of what he and his administration stood for. I don't have to tell you what the President Bush administration stands for ideologically and politically. They were quite clear about it. And we can debate endlessly about their policies in general, but it is this administration's lack of response to the natural disaster produced by Hurricane Katrina and the social catastrophe that was exacerbated by it. I mean, do nothing. Of course, you exacerbate the social catastrophe. These we can call a series of most unfortunate events. Katrina reached social catastrophe levels that is more than a natural phenomenon of this category would produce, because there was an absence of statecraft. Without excusing the dire performance of the state and municipal governments of Louisiana and New Orleans, and the lack of interaction between these and the federal government, the state, quite simply, was not there. Let me try and explain. Absence of statecraft is practiced by a state or a state entity which, having undergone a significant transformation of the public ethos, public ethos understood as the notion that the state serves the public through the provision of services, social or otherwise, is incapable to render adequate relief to its population in moments of exceptional urgency, hence the need to evaluate the behavior of the state in exceptional events. This lack of a capacity or absence of state actions can be compared to that of an economically precarious state, which, lacking money and logistical abilities, cannot respond effectively to a major natural disaster, thus exacerbating it more. The difference with the latter is that our federal government has the logistical and economic capabilities to fend off a crisis of this proportion, but chose not to render or dangerously delay the needed relief, thus intensifying the likelihood of the witnessed catastrophe. The lack of response of the Bush administration to Hurricane Katrina is an example of this. The distressing images brought by the media confirm to all of us something that we probably already knew but never imagined it would be shown in such an explicit manner, that the present components of our federal government did not care at the time, and still doesn't, for the public welfare, and that it is beyond doubt a debt to a conservative philosophy that puts the predominance of the individual over the social. The failure was total and at a multiplicity of levels. The evacuation plan, the lack of readiness before, during, and after the storm, and the post-hurricane management of the emergency. Perhaps most illustrative of this is the grim image of poor human beings distressed in front of that monument to opulence that is the Superdome. The paradox brought by this powerful image is, to say the least, upsetting. Perhaps, too, we can attribute this monumental failure at how a reorganization of the federal government after 9/11 rendered ineffective an agency like FEMA by diluting it, in the umbrella of Homeland Security. I'd like to conclude now, if I may. Most certainly, a continuous recollection of narratives and statistical document data will allow, like, for example, Arthur has done, will allow me and other researchers to validate this theoretical abstraction. Specifically, I endeavored to collect or analyze data that could reveal significant correlations confirming this framework. We also have a need of qualitative studies, especially of a longitudinal nature, such as what you're doing, that will deepen our understanding of this phenomenon. For example, measuring the social psychological state of the displaced and the populations of the states of Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama in the long term. In this sense, the American Academy of Social and Political Science has made a positive effort by publishing a series of studies touching this subject. Finally, these studies are necessary to further theoretical reflection on the nature of the contemporary state. Is a theoretical update really necessary? Are these concepts adequate to theorize on and about the state? I think they are, because the conservative elements of this administration are so ideological at depth, at laissez faire, that in policy they practice a laissez faire attitude. Therefore, we need talking points to contest these notions, because in the end we are only through common social and solidarity bonds, and ultimately the human condition. Thank you.
Thank you for these two presentations, and thank you for your attendance. If there are any questions, you may ask them.
Any questions? This is an ongoing work. I'll keep furthering it. For example, there were two brilliant works yesterday. One made by Dr. Jarrett. I don't remember his university. He worked something similar to mine. I'm working, from the theory of the state, but he was working from the concept of the social contract by Rousseau, and it was brilliant the way he talked about the breach of contract. And I think that's a notion that I as a political theorist and political scientist I can agree with. But there were also two colleagues from Howard University who were doing quantitative work, awareness of disaster, knowledge, and all that, and I think it was brilliant. And these are, along with Arthur Sands, these concerted efforts are, I think, that can contribute not only to academia, but to raise awareness and also to formulate, positive public policy towards preventing, towards readiness, but also, even if we cannot fend off natural disasters, we can prevent them from becoming social catastrophes. All right? Any more questions? That's it.
There are no more questions. Thank you for coming, and we ask you to feel free to visit our exhibit and to stay for the rest of the convention, and to come again next year. We'll again be here in New Orleans.
All right. Thank you.